Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lee Hancher, and I'm hosting today's debate in our FSR debate series. And today we're touching on a real hot topic, the issue of rising prices, but not just gas prices, of course, which has attracted a lot of attention, but the impact on electricity prices. And I'd like to turn the screen over to Alberto Pototschnig, who will be introducing the debate today. Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you, Lee, and good afternoon to all from my side as well. Well, the topic is very topical. Energy prices have increased significantly over the last few weeks. Gas prices have increased by more than 400% from before the summer, electricity prices by more than 200%, partly fueled by the increase in gas prices. Europe is mostly a price taker on the international gas market when it comes to electricity. Obviously, international prices play a role, but also local conditions, weather, production from renewables, and somebody claims also market design. The Commission has looked into it. A number of governments have come up with different recipes on how to deal with the impact of the increased prices, energy prices on consumers. The Commission, in order to stop uncoordinated action, has issued a set of measures, a toolkit for action mostly by national governments and regulators. Most of these toolkits most of the tools in the toolkit are actually aimed at reducing the impact of higher prices on consumers. However, at the same time, the Commission has asked ACER to look into the market design to see whether it can be improved, complemented, etc. And ACER issued, in fact, even before the Commission came out, an initial assessment, or at least a note on energy prices, and then on Monday this week, an initial assessment. So the ball is rolling for an assessment of what could be a proper or a useful market design for the future. This has been discussed for many years now. The higher prices, which are not part of the transition, they're not created by the transition will come and will impact prices probably, but it's focusing the higher prices are focusing the minds of policymakers and other stakeholders to look at what could be a market design which is fit for purpose for the future, and what elements of the current market design are still proper for this future design. So this is what, without trying to preempt the work of ACER, this is what we'll try to discuss today, when we don't have any ambition to come to any conclusion, but at least to spell out the dimension of this reflection. So to do this, we have a couple of speakers in the initial part, and then I will hand over to Lee for the debate, where we have other stakeholders and other speakers, experts joining us. So first of all, I would like to introduce Carlos Batlle. He is with the Florence School of Regulation. He's also at MIT at Comillas for an academic reflection. He's joining us from an airport in the US. I understand it's Boston. So Carlos, thank you very much for joining us. And up to you, over to you for an academic reflection on the latest development.
Okay, so I hope that I'm going to put this because it's compulsory. Sorry for the weird situation, but we talk also about how the electricity industry could work better. But when we talk about the air flight industry, we could also discuss a lot. Also, in that particular case, I'm only a user. So, well, let me start by saying something that when Alberto came, asked me to say, why don't you do an academic introduction to the topic? For me, it was an amazing challenge, because I think that this discussion, which by the way, it comes originally from my home country. So also bear with me that it is a topic that is not easy for me to put on the table for a number of reasons. It is difficult to face. Why? Because it is about discussing the very, very basics of regulatory economics at the lowest level. So by that, I would start by just taking a quote from the common statement of the Spanish, French, and other governments who claim that there is a need to establish a link between the price paid by consumers and the average production cost of electricity in national production mixes. So if you look at the academics, which is my case, and where I try to teach economic regulation, as you can imagine, it is hard to read something that basically implies linking prices with average costs in a marketed context. I mean, this is something that in the first class of basic economics is what we try to explain to students. So starting by that, what else can we do? I mean, we are in a context, in my opinion, that in which we are having discussions in the electricity sector that consist of this lack of this misunderstanding between marginal costs and average costs, the misunderstanding between about locational prices. So we are listening to lots of voices saying that it doesn't make any sense that different customers pay different prices in different locations for electricity, but nobody is really surprised by paying different prices for a bottle of water here in Logan Airport, differently if I take the metro and I go somewhere else, and the price for the same asset is different. So to some extent, I must confess that this current situation is a little bit disheartening. Going then to the point, we are in a context now in which certainly I think that the recent event on the gas prices plus CO2 prices in Europe has somehow awakened the big mass population on a reality, and it is the fact that the decarbonization that we need to actually put forward is going to be expensive. Because if otherwise it would be business as usual, it would not occur. And we have given us in Europe a framework that it is basically based on a market approach. So I think that with all my respect for all purposes, I am not going to claim, or I don't know if the market approach is better than a centralized cost of service based approach. I mean, this is a discussion that depends on the belief, economic belief of each of us. And I tend to think that the market approach is a better way to go. But the first message that I think that we should, I would like to send is that if we go for a market approach, we have to actually believe in the market. And if not, let's move all the way backwards to the other end. But trying to stay in the middle with kind of not very rigorous recipes, it is the worst of the worlds, in my opinion. This would be my first point in that. I've been trying to somehow explore to this 10-minute introduction, which were the actual proposals that have been put on the table to somehow amend the market mechanism. And I must confess that I was not really able to find any conclusive one that I could somehow evaluate. And maybe it is my fault. So it's difficult for me to really give an opinion because I don't really know exactly what is being actually proposed. Because, well, you can say that prices have to be based on the average cost, that prices have to be based on, or the different technologies have to be paid in a different way. But I think that these ideas like that are so unfeasible that I tend to struggle a little bit on what is being discussed. What I do think is that we are in a moment in which we should somehow reinforce the importance of the short-term market. We have been working for 2 decades in actually look for ways to pass through end users this marginal idea. We have started finally to design hopefully hourly rates. And I think the Spanish example was a very good example for the last 7 years. And these sort of discussions, in my opinion, are really disappointing, because what we are somehow sending again, or the message that is being sent, is that electricity customers don't want to bother about prices. And it is really, as I said before, really disheartening. Beyond that, I think that I cannot say anything better than the document that ACER published last Monday. I think it's a brilliant piece of work. I am going to take it directly to my students here at MIT and also at the Florence School of Regulation as the term task. Like, read this. This is what you have to know for the first class of basic economics, not only the electricity public sector, where you can see, I mean, I cannot add more than that. So in my opinion, my best advice would be to read and analyze this document, which, by the way, doesn't say anything that, again, it is not supposed to be understood in the 2 first classes of economic regulation, but it's beautifully written. Beyond that, I think that any other idea that it is about thinking of some sort of expropriation of the investment, the potential income coming from market-based investment decisions, is a terrible idea. I think that we should, in any case, discard that approach. Said so, I fully acknowledge that we have a problem with long-term uncertainty, and this is something that I have been arguing for a lot of time. So it is true that to some extent we might need to go to some other approaches that might entail long-term contracting or maybe regulated long-term contracting, like some sort of capacity markets or something like that. I don't think that both things are. I mean, both things can perfectly coexist, but always doing it in a way in which we try to somehow respect the short-term price signal. So yes, the price for gas has to affect the price for electricity. This is what we need to actually move forward in decarbonization. We shouldn't forget about that. And I will only finish with one last comment. As I mentioned before, talking about the experience in my home country, in Spain, I have always said that we are very good at as regulatory analysts, because we have made all the mistakes possible. So when you are in a country where you have made all the mistakes, you can actually know. But also, we have made some good things. And for instance, the electricity rates that have been implemented in Spain in the last 7 until very recently, the network rates are, I think, an example that is the best thing that has been done in many years around the world. The sad thing about this extraordinary situation, as some governments call it, is that the intervention specifically of the Spanish government, what has ended up in more or less destroying the work that was being done on engaging customers to really react to prices. So this is the saddest part of the whole thing. And I hope that with documents that I want from ACER, and I hope also that the upcoming action from the Commission and from ACER, we can actually retake the car to the road and going into the right direction. Finishing with one thing, this does not mean that we need to care about vulnerable customers. And by that, I don't mean that this is not going to be an issue that we have to deal with, but always keeping the marginal signal. And I would finish with this, because it could be talking for a long while. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlos. And just to clarify that Carlos is not at the airport deliberately. He was trying to travel and he was delayed for more than, I think, 12 hours or something like that. So he should have already reached destination.
Let me tell the story in a second. Cross-border protection here in the US, yesterday in New York, they thought that I was a drug dealer, a Mexican drug dealer. And they had me on hold for 3 hours at the airport, and I lost my connection to Boston. So I flew this morning at 6 a.m. That's the reason why. Sorry for that.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Now we move to Rafael Muruais-Garcia from ACER. Carlo mentioned, I mentioned, very interesting note issued by ACER. So, Rafael, you are going to present some of the findings, right?
Indeed. Thank you. Maybe just confirmation. Can you hear me well, and can you see the slides displayed?
Loud and clear.
Okay, and the slides as well, right?
Indeed.
Okay. So thank you, Alberto, and also thank you to Carlos for the reference to our initial work. So indeed, I have a few slides. So maybe in the interest of time, I will try to be brief, and maybe I skip a few slides. So apologize upfront for that. And actually, some of the messages are along the lines of what Carlos introduced at the beginning. Yeah, so I will try to cover these 4 topics. So first, how we see what has been the trigger of the debate that we are having today, and on which we are grateful for being able to contribute. I will refer to our newly published preliminary assessment, even though, as you know, we'll have a further elaboration on that. I will then finalize with some policy considerations about the topic of today, and I will briefly mention what is our intended scope of our upcoming work. So starting with the trigger, I mean, this is of course well known, but let's remember that the trigger of the debate today has been this unprecedented high prices that we saw over the last few months. Nevertheless, this on the one hand, this is something that has not been seen before, but it also raised some concerns first about perceived price volatility, but it also brought together some other debates that were already before those high prices were on the table. So this is to say that the debate as such about the ability of market design to deliver some desired outcomes is not new, and the concern of price volatility has been exacerbated now because of this increase on high prices. But it brings overall to the table one of the, in our view, most of the relevant debates, that is to discuss whether the existing market design is well prepared for driving the investments that are necessary to drive the energy transition. I think that we understand that this is the main 2 points of the discussion. On the one hand, how to address this perceived issue of volatility or of sudden price increases, as we saw, and on the other hand, how to drive the necessary investments. I just put here on this slide how the future system is going to look like. I think that there is quite an agreement that we are leading towards decarbonization progressively at the pace that our politicians will be able to agree upon, knowing that this is in a global context, but with particularly European features. Knowing that the needs for flexibility will increase dramatically in the next coming years as a consequence of the growing penetration of intermittent sources, and also knowing that the type of technologies will be more and more capital intensive as opposed to conventional generation that we had till now. In this context, as you know, the European Commission published a toolbox that mainly aimed to short-term advice or short-term measures that could help mitigating the impact, in particular on vulnerable consumers, with the current that are compatible with the current legal context. And it also tasked ACER to look into the current market design, both on the benefits and drawbacks of the existing market design, with a view to the European Commission to have or to get better informed decisions in the near future. As part of this assessment, we were also asked to produce a preliminary initial assessment that we did in 2 parts. The last one has been published last Monday, as Carlos and Alberto mentioned. So as part of our assessment, we first focus, before going into elements of market design that will be mostly the focus of our upcoming publication, but so far we focused on trying to understand what have been the main drivers for the price increase. I think that this is well acknowledged and understood that the main reason for the price increase has been in the supply side of the gas sector, knowing that this is a global issue, but also with some European specificities. In particular, what has happened in Europe is that Europe had to cope with a lower level of supply, in particular to Europe, around 10% of lower supply than in previous years. That was mostly absorbed by demand, by gas storage. On this, of course, and as is well known, was impacted severely or explained as one of the main the key factor displaying the increasing electricity prices, but there were also additional drivers that drove the increase in prices, namely the coal and carbon increase that was going in parallel over the same period, and some then also to a lesser extent some other conditions that occurred, like weather conditions and a slightly lower production of renewables compared to what it was expected. One element that we also tried to look into, because it was put on the table mostly on the electricity side, because on the gas side there is a higher level of price convergence, also because the level of granularity between electricity and gas markets is, as well known, very different. In the electricity markets, also not surprisingly, there were differences in the levels of price and the level of prices over the last few weeks, even though the increase was general across all bidding zones in Europe. In that respect, we knowing that any analysis is always an oversimplification of reality, but just trying to summarize into two main elements. The two main elements that we identified, and we, in that respect, clustered the countries across Europe into three groups. Essentially, these two elements were, on the one hand, the level of reliance on gas compared to national demand, and the level of interconnectivity of countries. This means that in general, and I want to emphasize this in general because there are always specificities and other factors, but in general, the higher the dependence on gas fuel compared to national demand during this period, and the lower the level of interconnectivity for a given country, the higher the impact has been. Having said that, there are other factors, as for example, the geographical factor is one. So those countries that are close to the cheaper sources of energy had the possibility to have a slightly lower impacts, and also the import or export situation. So those countries that exported, for example, contributed to smoothen the prices in their on their neighboring bidding zones. Now, perhaps moving quickly to few policy considerations that were partly included in our initial assessment and will be further elaborated in the upcoming months. Knowing the difficulties of the debate and that the focus is on market design, we want to bring to the attention of the readers and of the audience that one element, or there are several elements, several components on the bill on which the government can intervene or act. And other than looking into market design, that is of course relevant and necessary, there is room to act where necessary, in particular to protect the most vulnerable. And we have seen this sort of temporary interventions or actions in these components. There is room to intervene or to act in other components of the bill, such as the taxes and levies, or also resort to other type of measures, such as social security measures. Having said that, the dilemma is still there, and the dilemma in our view is how to keep the role of price signals to drive the desired behavior, being this behavior efficiency, or being this behavior the right investments that want to be seen in the future, while at the same time protecting the most vulnerable from specifically sudden increases in prices. We are well aware that there seem to be, in particular, we have seen this in the recent weeks, sometimes opposing and very extreme positions, which we acknowledge as a challenge, as a fact that is there. And those positions may range from saying that liberalized markets will never be able to drive the decarbonization process, from other completely opposing views that say, please stay away from intervening in the market, let us as innovators, I'm putting this in the voice of innovators, let us innovators drive the change. So these are the opposing views that we see. Acknowledging this challenge and where we are, the key technical questions that we intend to address in the next coming months. The first one is, as I said, to look into the benefits and drawbacks of current market design. And then the two issues we will be looking at mainly will be the issue of sufficient revenue certainty, in particular in view of the necessary investments over the next years and decades. And the third one is what options could be out there to cushion, to some extent, the perceived price volatility that impacts, in particular, vulnerable consumers. It's a bit premature still to go into details on what will exactly be all the options that we'll be analyzing. We just try to put some of those that have been not necessarily put on the table in recent weeks, but maybe in recent times, so including also a few years before, but they become as relevant in this debate. And this may range from issues related to improving the certainty of long-term in the long term. This could be from just keeping most of the current design, for example, but introducing some targeted improvements, for example, to unlock demand response, or could be a bit more substantial, such as, for example, the promotion or the implementation of some type of long-term contracting, and there could be different options to be analyzed. This would be more on the longest term, in a slightly shorter term, but still not in the very, very short term, but still to facilitate some hedging. There is still room, in our view, to improve and possibly to analyze options to improve the functioning of forward markets. And then in the lower part of the slide, you see other measures that have been mentioned and that may deserve or not some analysis, such as the possibility of changing the pricing rules or some sort of ex-post adjustments of the revenues with some related impacts. So that would be some of the options we may be analyzing during the next coming months. Just to finalize, perhaps some reflection of aspects that we consider that when analyzing and for any type of market design should be preserved to the extent possible. The first one is the short-term efficient use of resources. As Carlos mentioned before, we have all of us across Europe have been working over the last 2 decades to have market coupling up and running with substantial benefits. So we believe that this is something to be preserved. In the same direction, also, it's necessary for the sake of efficiency to keep the benefits from market integration. The role of demand, we understand that should be preserved, as well as the role of energy efficiency as such. And also in the same direction, we believe that any market design should also allow for preventing market abuse. Finally, and maybe as a final remark, whenever we analyze and we discuss issues about revenue certainty, which we understand is something that could be desirable, we would like to stress that this should not be understood the same as guaranteed cost recovery or absolute revenue certainty that would lead to other type of outcomes that are perhaps less desirable. Thank you, and I leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much. Thank you
very much, Rafael. Thank you for your very interesting presentation of what ACER has been analyzing and what ACER will do. So that's complete the introductory part, and congratulations, by the way, for the analysis. And now I'll pass the screen to Lee for the debate. Lee.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you both speakers. Carlos obviously has to cope with very difficult circumstances, so very admirable presentation, and Rafael, I think, has managed to convey very clearly where ACER has been concentrating its energies in preparing its preliminary report and where it will go further. So I'd like now to turn to the debate, and we have 2 very distinguished panelists to join us today. So these are Yvan Hachez from Eurelectric and Kristin Holm from EFET. And I'd like to turn to Yvan first to give him the floor to react to the two short talks that we've heard so far. Thank you.
Okay, first, thank you for inviting Eurelectric in this debate, and I can only join Alberto and Rafael when they highlight the quality of the work done by ACER in their preliminary assessment. I think it's a very interesting work, and it will indeed structure the discussion for the months to come. I think also it's important to have to frame well the discussion. One needs to have consideration indeed for the short-term wholesale markets, and you need to make sure that it's functioning properly. And we believe at Eurelectric that the current power market designed for the short term, which is based on a competitive marginal pricing, is delivering an efficient price signal. It drives the dispatching decision in a sound way. It promotes the decarbonization, and it also gives the possibility and the incentive for storage and demand response to participate in the market. So this is rather positive, and of course this is one part of the story. The second part of the story is the impact on consumers. And I think it was also mentioned the importance to mitigate the price volatility for consumers, and for sure to protect the vulnerable consumers from being harmed somehow by the energy transition. And so, in this respect, it's important to not to take too quickly decisions that are in fact harming the system more than it should do. And we believe that there is no real benefit in those short-sighted political measures that are put forward, and I think they could even be detrimental. And I think Rafael mentioned this for the confidence of the consumers, but also for the confidence of the investor. And both will be important in the future for achieving the targets by 2030 and forward in 2050. And it's important to use, in fact, the tools that are available in the electricity markets, so the hedging tools, the fact that there are indeed different time frames for electricity, to make sure that suppliers can offer contracts to consumers that are in line with their expectation, or also the risk that they are ready to take. Some consumers might be willing indeed to be fully exposed to the market because they want to be really active on the market, and other consumers might not have enough knowledge, or might need to be protected from this volatility, and so they might go for other types of contract, maybe fixed term contract, or less dynamic contract, but still a bit of viability. So there is a choice to be made there, and there is an offer to be made by suppliers, but please no short-sighted political measures like the one that were evoked in Spain or in Romania, for instance. And then the third aspect, and I think we've touched upon, is indeed there will be investments needed to have this transition and to achieve the targets. And it's important to have a long-term view for investors and an appropriate framework. We see this, for instance, with corporate PPAs. We see this with some countries putting in place capacity mechanism and so on. But it's important to promote those additional investments with the appropriate risk hedging tools over the longer term. And then maybe a final point on the elements that were that are contained in this preliminary assessment. I think we all look forward to the report in April 2022, and in the meantime, we are of course ready to rediscuss with the different people around the table to help achieve something that is needed for the industry, but also the consumers as well. which are all stakeholders in these energy transitions. Voilà.
Thank you very much for your very insightful contribution to the discussion. I'd like now to turn to IFIEC, to Kristin Holm, for her reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. You hear me well, I hope?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Actually, I'm representing IFIEC. I'm the chair of the Working Party Electricity in IFIEC, and by that I'm representing the energy-intensive industries across Europe. And I would like to start to say that energy is a substantial part of our production costs. And as we compete globally, we cannot pass on any extra cost into product prices. So it is a fact that the price rise we've seen recently has led to production plant closures and cutbacks in Europe. And even though gas prices have also risen in other regions where our competitors are, we have some other effects in Europe with the increasing carbon costs impacting electricity costs, and also some unfavorable weather conditions, which has hit the European industry harder than other places in the world. I think the cause of the high energy prices have been well described by ACER, and I just join all the others saying that the assessments ACER have done so far are very good and can be used in many circumstances. And we agree with them that the price rise is not a sign of malfunctioning markets, but basically based on fundamentals. And we also welcome the upcoming assessment that they will deliver in April, and the debate that will follow after that, I assume, and we will engage actively in that. I'll continue to say that we also support the marginal price setting. And we think that's the best way to optimize the capacity in the system, to the production capacity and the grid capacity, and also the flexibility that is in the system. So we think that the marginal pricing should still be the core of the market design. But of course, all the market integration and the market improvements that has started with better representing the physics and reduce the total system costs, which is the main goal of the markets, should continue. And but we have to say that the product standardization must be balanced towards the technical possibilities. But we support the initiatives on local flex markets and things like that. We do not support price caps or interventions in the market mechanisms, like decoupling gas from power or average price or things like that, which will make the situation very unpredictable, and we don't think that guarantee long-term lowest possible cost for us. We think the discussion on super profits for renewables should be handled through the tax system. But producers, of course, must need to keep a fair share of their investment costs. As we know, renewable technologies with significant upfront capital investment costs needs to capture market prices significantly above their operating costs for many hours. And this might be challenging if the cannibalization effect is too high. IFIEC means that capacity mechanisms that is needed for adequacy reasons should be kept at the minimum, but at the same time ensure confidence and sufficient power supply in all timeframes and predictability in the price setting, and should be designed to encourage all technologies demand and storage to offer the flexibility to the system on a voluntary basis and adequately remunerated. Access to affordable low-carbon energy represents key conditions for a competitive transition of energy-intensive industries. So most important for us is that the investments in decarbonized power supply and infrastructure keep pace with the demand. So it's very important to focus on barriers for building more renewables, including van availability, slow authorization processes, lack of grid, unfavorable tax system, and so on, must be removed to avoid undersupply of renewable power or of power as such. We want also to put barriers in the PPA markets higher on the agenda. Renewable PPAs is not a perfect match for industry, as many like to think. It's a good basis that new renewable projects need to secure their income through long-term offtake agreements, but the volatile supply do not match our baseload consumption, and the cost of profiling is too high in many regions and impossible to hedge long-term. Improvements in the possibilities to hedge baseload consumption long-term must be addressed. We see that public support for renewables will reduce their risk and cost for the developers, but that it will also reduce the PPA market for industries. So there must be a thorough assessment of the need for subsidies. Another issue with regard to renewable PPAs is that solar and wind potential is often far from where the industry production is located, and the grid bottlenecks are high. We've seen rising area price differences, many prices. A cross-zonal PPA is not a valid hedge, as it is difficult to find someone to take on the area price risk at acceptable compensation. Even in the Nordic, this is an increasing challenge. I will also mention, as a last thing, that for us to be able to commit to long-term sourcing strategies, we need competitive level and predictability also for the grid tariff and regulatory costs, and an adequate protection from indirect CO2 costs. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That again, an excellent contribution and some very insightful comments from the point of view of the large consumers, energy intensive consumers. I'd like to now turn to the polls. We have a number of polling questions for you, and Alberto will introduce these polls for us today. Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you, Lee. Yes, indeed, we have 4 polls today, more than usual, and some of them are fairly complex, so we'll go it slowly. The first one, not surprisingly, is about pay-as-bid versus pay-as-cleared, and the question is whether pay-as-bid would be, as opposed to pay-as-cleared, would be a better suited approach for pricing in the day-ahead market for Europe. And now you have 7 choices. The first one is yes, so pay-as-bid is better because it reduces the overall payment to resources selling into the market. The second one is yes, it is better, pay-as-bid is better because it is more transparent. The third option, so option C, is yes, because both A and B, so both because it reduces payment to resources selling the market, it is more transparent, and possibly for other reasons. Fourth is no, pay-as-bid is not better than pay-as-clear because it increases risks for market participants, especially the smaller ones. Fifth, no, pay-as-bid is not better than pay-as-clear. Pay-as-clear, the current system is better because it delivers a less efficient pay-as-bid delivers a less efficient outcome and makes cross-border, cross-zonal coupling more difficult. 6, so option F, no, it's better to stay with the current system because of the 2 problems with pay-as-bid that we've just mentioned, i.e. it increases the risk and it delivers a less efficient outcome. And 7th, G, you have no opinion. So please take some time to read the options. Yes, meaning pay-as-bid is better. No means pay as clear is better. And then you have various, 2 options or 3 options for giving the reasons for your answer. So the first 3 possibilities are in favor of moving to pay as bid. The second 3, so D, E, and F, for those who believe that the pay as clear, the current system should be preserved, and there you have various possibilities. Okay, so well, that's interesting because we have quite a number of, I would say, a majority of respondents going for option F, which is the current system is better for a number of reasons, including the 2 ones that are outlined there. That's interesting. Thank you very much. Now we move to the second question. The second question is, should the day-ahead market remain as the reference market, which is the market producing the price index that is used in other markets or contract, also in a future possibly augmented market design? So the first option, option 8, is yes, the day-ahead market should remain, should continue to provide the reference, in that sense remain the reference market. No, second option is no, so B is no, as short-term price signals could be provided by the balancing market, balancing mechanism. C, no, because with an increased share of renewables in the system, electricity will be mostly traded long-term, so we don't need short-term market signals any longer. And D, you have no opinion. So again, this is a bit simpler, fewer options, but please vote. Okay, there seems to be some concentration on the yes. The short-term market, the day-ahead market should continue to be the reference market. Thank you very much, Chiara. I think we now move to the next one. And the next one is looking at long-term electricity trading. And so to the extent that electricity will be traded long-term, which long-term instruments would you favor? Physical power purchase agreement, that's option A. Financial hedging instrument, that's option B. Other instruments, that option C, or no preference, that option D. And I'm sorry for the panelists not being able to vote. But... Okay, well, there seems to be, well, that's more dispersed between physical and financial, and then maybe it would be interesting to see what other options one could think. Next one, and here we're talking. Here we turn to capacity remuneration mechanism or capacity mechanisms. And the question is, where capacity mechanisms are in place, to what extent can or should they also protect consumers from price volatility risk? And the first option is capacity mechanism can generally protect consumers from price volatility risk. Second option, option B, only some capacity mechanisms, for example, reliability options, can protect or might protect consumers from price volatility risk. And the third option is capacity mechanisms serve a different purpose, adequacy, than protecting consumers from price volatility risk, and therefore they're not suited to protect consumers from price volatility risk in general. So please vote. Okay, so there seems to be overwhelming majority saying that capacity mechanism serves a different purpose, which is an interesting. I think Carlos at the beginning said, we have to see whether they can coexist, hedging instrument and capacity mechanism. So I turn it now back to Lee. Just to one last comment. If any participants want to pose questions in the later debate, please put them in the Q&A facility in the platform. So thank you very much for voting. Lee, back to you.
Thank you indeed for voting. It was quite a complex menu today of choices, but I think some clear trends were emerging. And I'd first of all like to ask the panel, as well as our speakers today, to comment on the outcomes. So if Carlos is still at the airport, I'm not sure if he's there, if he would like to say a few words on the outcome of any one or all of the 4 polls.
Okay, here I am. Well, no, I don't have just a small clarification on the pay as bid versus marginal pricing. I think that well, there is one big issue there, who is simply the fact that if market agents can freely bid in and they are under subject to pay as bid, what they are going to do is they're going to try to guess which the marginal price is going to be, and therefore they will make lots of mistakes and it will be less efficient. So I think it would be a bad idea. I have the impression that, I mean, some people might be thinking about pay as bid as a way to somehow put limits on certain income for certain technologies, but maybe I'm wrong. So I don't buy it. I agree with the result of the poll. And only one very brief comment on the capacity mechanisms, as Alberto was mentioning. When I was saying, I was talking about this, I was not pretending to argue that there should be a compulsory way of shielding all sorts of customers against these abnormal high prices. But to some extent, the fact is that we need to somehow try to look for ways to provide the long-term markets in electricity with liquidity, because this is really an issue. Not necessarily for the investment approach, because clearly for that, this is the capacity market solution, and I don't think this is the topic for discussion today. But at least in the short to medium term, it would be important to do something about that. I don't know if enhancing the role of market makers who actually exist in some places, trying to promote some sort of energy releases, voluntary energy releases of any sort, but something would need to be done. And finally, I would say that the only thing that I don't like as a customer is that I am forced to enter into long-term contracts. So one thing that I like a lot from the Spanish kind of standard or default tariff design in which I was involved was that it was exposing the customers to the volatility risk. And then if for whatever reason something like what is happening now takes place, then the customer, if he is worried about this volatility, can enter into a long-term contract with a retailer. So I tend to think that this is the way to go and not the other way around. And this is the part that I don't like from those discussions.
Thank you, Carlos. Rafael, would you like to pick up on some of the outcomes of the polls? And you perhaps saw there was also a question to you in the chat, which actually also reflects the last comments from Carlos on market liquidity being so important, and how do we stimulate that, perhaps with market maker functions. I don't know if you want to also reflect on that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first, so maybe to reflection only on the poll, and then maybe trying to mention the issue of liquidity. On the poll, I think that the first reaction is, I think it's in a way, I mean, we are glad to see that at least some of the aspects of market design that have been done over the last few years, or have been implemented over the last few years and decades, there seems to be a consensus that some of them bring benefits and should be maintained, at least as the first insight from the audience replies. So I think that that's good. But this again doesn't mean that options need still to be analyzed. So the fact that something works well doesn't mean that things can work better. Then a second thought, and when we were looking at different options, I think that in principle, any option that makes some sense deserves some analysis. as we try to convey in the slides, I think that what matters a little bit, or what the starting point should be, to analyze what the current market design is delivering better and what aspects are not delivering so well. And I think that there seems to be an understanding that for short-term efficiency, all has gone in the right direction. I mean, of course, with some still aspects to be implemented. But when it comes to coping with the right price signals for investment, in particular at a point in time where there is sort of a need to push quickly, if I can use that word, towards a certain direction of decarbonization, there may be other complementary tools that can be analyzed. And I think that this is where we need to look at, and of course also from the demand side as well. I think that IFIEC was talking before about certain needs that can be met or cannot be met, even if sometimes we as regulators think that some products may be fit for purpose, it can be that is not always the case. So I think that this is the ideas we need to have in mind. What is being served correctly today and should be kept, and what is served less well, and there is some room for improvement. And then finally, and maybe connecting all these things with the liquidity discussion, I think that there has been recurrent, comments over the last few years that liquidity, in particular for long-term markets, is an issue. I think that there may be indeed a need to look into this aspect, but as we also try to explain, I think that still liquidity at least for the time horizons that are being managed today, that are typically between 1 to 3 years, this may indeed help to manage the normal business situations and the volatility of prices to some extent, so business continuity. But we believe that and I think it's also mentioned by some, that it may not be enough to drive the investments because the time horizon for the investments is much longer. So if we would have to work, we would have to work in three time horizons. One is the short term that seems to go in the right direction. Another one is this medium term of normal hedging products for business continuity, if I can put it this way. And a third layer of discussion is this a bit longer term investment price signals. The three, in our view, deserve some attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Inge would like to pick up from here on the outcome of the polls and the discussion so far.
Yes, I can do that. On the first, the pay as bid. Well, as I said, we think pay as bid, or the marginal pricing system, provides the best transparency and visibility in the price setting, and ensure the optimal use in operations. So that's what we think is the best way. When it comes to they have as a reference price, I think that's just what it is when we negotiate the contracts. The spot price or the expected prices in the spot in the future will always be kind of a reference for negotiations in contracts. I'm not sure what we can do about that, but I don't know the retail markets, because we operate in the wholesale markets and negotiate the huge volumes of contracts. So maybe we operate in a very different markets than the retailers. So it might be other issues there that I can comment on. When it comes to hedging instruments, for us, we need both physical PPAs and we need financial hedging instruments. And physical, like renewable PPAs, has been a good way for us to also to document green power supply. But financial hedging instruments, at least if you can hedge or price baseload through financial hedging instruments, would be great. It needs to be a liquid market. So and the difficult thing is to find out how to create this liquidity. and market makers is of course one way of doing it, but market makers will not be market makers if they are not compensated, and who should pay for that? So we are just worried that we get costs through other levies or something. So that also needs to be addressed. And if the risk is too high, I don't think anyone will voluntarily be a market maker. So I don't know. When it comes to capacity mechanisms, I think we see that that's needed for adequacy reasons in many regions. IFIEC has a position that it should be kept at the minimum because we think that the total system costs, which is the most important, which should be the target for everything we do, to reduce the total system costs. I think that's best if price signals are in the market, and price signals are important for enabling flexibility in the market. So it needs to find a balance there as well. And capacity remuneration also needs to be financed by someone. So again, we are worried about the regulatory costs for financing of subsidies and capacity mechanisms and all these things, because regulatory cost is very distortive for competition because it's unpredictable, it's short-term, impossible to hedge, and it's not competitive in a global level playing field. Okay, a long speech, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. Also introducing some new elements to the discussion on the regulatory costs. So now turning back to the producers, to the sector. Yvan, would you like to comment for us? Thank you.
Maybe first on capacity mechanism. So there is indeed a framework in the electricity regulation for setting up a capacity mechanism in case of adequacy issue. And it's true that it could then protect consumers from price volatility that would be created by some disequilibrium between the supply and the demand. But as such, it's not the aim. The aim is really to ensure security of supply. And the second effect is that it would protect the consumers against those very high price or even this absence of supply. But I think it's a different topic, and indeed, then you could discuss about the design features of your capacity mechanism. And for instance, in Belgium, we have a reliability option, a capacity market with a reliability options. And indeed, the idea is that if the price goes above a certain level, the capacity that benefits from a capacity contract would have to reimburse, so that we avoid to, on the one hand, having a capacity remuneration, and on the other hand, benefiting from very high price spikes. So that's one comment. Maybe on the long-term trading, I heard Inger on those corporate PPAs, and I think she pointed out to the example of having a PPA with let's say the demand in one country and the supply, for instance, in another country. Let's take, for instance, Spain for the sun, for the wind, and the demand in Germany. And it's true that there is then a cross-border risk when you contract a PPA, in the sense that you can hedge the risk, the transmission risk between two price zones for the next year, but you cannot over a longer period. So you cannot hedge this price risk, and this creates a barrier somehow for contracting those cross-border PPA over a long period, because someone has to bear this risk. It's difficult for the producers. It's also difficult for the consumers, of course. And so it means that transmission system operator should probably make those products available. On the discussion about should the direct market be the reference, I think it's also important to keep in mind that producers and suppliers, they have and also big consumers, they have hedging strategies. So they will hedge, they will sell in advance for next year, for the year +2, their production, or they will source the supply for next year, year +2, year +3, and it's possible over the liquidity horizon of the market. And so they will basically have a basket of sourcing costs for a supplier, and the same for producers. And so I think it goes beyond this discussion about pointing one single reference. Indeed, I think the date markets will serve as a reference, but there are other products that are available, and it's rather complex. And indeed, there is a role there for the suppliers to provide the right product to its consumers. Voilà. And on the PSB, PS Clear, I think I mentioned initially that indeed PS Clear is very important for several reasons. And I think we mentioned most of them in the discussion before.
Thank you very much. Thank you for picking up also on the first poll. We still have some time left, and luckily we can, I think, pick up on some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A. And Luis Parada was there first, and he, I think, had a question that goes to the heart of the discussion here. And if I can paraphrase it, the question really goes to what's the cause of all this? Has it got everything to do with the transition or nothing to do with the transition? So perhaps that would be a question that the panel would be anxious to reflect on. So I will turn the floor first to Rafael, if you would like to comment on that question.
Yes, can you repeat once again? You said what's the cost of how was the starting of the question? What's the cost of the?
Well, if you see in the chat, it's quite a longish comment, so I tried to shorten it, and I hope I'm doing it justice. But I think that what Luis is arguing is the real issue here is the cost of the transition. That's what we're looking at. So this is what we have to deal with. It's not just a short-term hike in gas prices that's causing the problem. So I think that's, I hope, clear.
Sure, understood. I think that it's a legitimate question, but at the same time, at least our understanding, the issues that are being seen today would have occurred anyway in almost any situation. Once you have a design where prices are marginal and you have an externality, as in this case was the gas prices, causing to some extent externality in the sense of an element that cannot be easily controllable from Europe, there is always the impact that we are observing could be expected. I mean, it is true that with the objective of decarbonization, it intensifies the issue. So the challenge is there, and I think it's something to be acknowledged that because of the decarbonization and because of this wish of accelerating the process, it makes the whole process more challenging. So that would be a bit how to look at that. At the same time, as I said before, in any situation, I think that the need for having some visibility on investments, the need to make certain markets efficient, the need to attract demand response to participate as much as possible to support the system, all those aspects are there. Now, with decarbonization, those are even more evident. That's true. But I don't think that the debate is only about transition and how much it costs. It is with transition, the challenges that were already there are even more of a challenge. And this is how I would summarize our views on it.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to take up that question? We have another question coming from Astrid Brunt, and she asks, she gets back to the hedging topic and asks for, have we got any views on the best alternative hedging to day ahead as a reference price? Throw that open.
Maybe I'll take that one. I think it really depends on your on the risk profile of the consumers. Some consumers might like the day price for some reasons, and others might want, for instance, a 3 years fixed contract. And it's a bit like if you go to your bank for some profile, a regular bank account will be quite good. For others, it will be bonds. For a third group, it will be shares. Of course, you can do a mix of everything. So it all depends on your risk profile, what you are ready to take as risk and also as benefit somehow.
Thank you. Inge, would you like to comment on that? Because perhaps your members have a different profile.
I very much agree with what Jan just said, that the day ahead, when you enter into, or when you negotiate the contract between a producer and a consumer, I think the day ahead will kind of be a reference, but it also depends on the risk profile and the appetite to get into the contract. So also the renewable developers, they need a predictable income, so they kind of negotiate the price down to the level that's acceptable income for them, maybe, if it's, the supply is higher than demand. So it depends on the supply-demand balance and also the risk appetite and also the day ahead as a mix of that, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you for a clear answer. And then we have a question. It's again directed to Rafael on long-term investment signals, and to what extent, this is a question from Bram Kleis from RAP. To what extent do you think that the reformed ETS, so post Fit for 55, will provide the necessary signals or directions, or will it not do that? Maybe complex question, but I don't know if there's a short answer.
Yeah, I think it will be a little bit out of the scope of our usual territory, like as ACER, but I mean, there is indeed an interaction. I think that there can be a consensus that best solution would be to have the fantastic ETS market, and that works to solve all the challenges that we are facing or that we will face for decarbonization. But we will possibly have to live with the limitations of the pace at which the ETS can progress. So in general, we consider this more as an input that we have to, from the electricity market design point of view, we have to look at, rather than something that we are directly influencing as ACER, for example. So it's definitely, there is a connection. So the functioning of those markets have a direct impact on how they can contribute to the decarbonization process, and as a price signal. The better they function, for sure, the better it will be for facilitating decarbonization. But in a way, knowing that this goes a little bit out of the territory of the classical regulatory decisions, at least from traditional regulators' point of view, we normally consider this as an input. We look at it, we look how it developed, we look what are the options on the table, and then we'll see. And this may actually determine how much there will be a need to adapt the market design from electricity point of view to contribute to the goals.
Thank you, very clear. Carlos, if you're available, I don't know, what would you tell your students? How would you expect your students to answer that question?
Well, I cannot add much on what Rafael said. I can just make a big comment on what on the next question that is on the Q&A, which is talking about creating a regulated long-term market, which is an old proposal from many perspectives. I can make 2 comments on that. A capacity market is nothing but that. So it's a regulated way to push people to contract in the long run, because in general, creating a regulated long-term market is a difficult thing to do, because this always implies that you have to push any of both counterparties to contract when they don't want to do it naturally. So capacity market is a way to push on behalf, contracting on behalf of demand for the long run. Other attempts that have been tried to be implemented in many places have not been successful, because you can create a platform, you can create a trading place, but if the market is not eager to enter into this long-term contracting for a number of reasons, both supply and demand, nothing will happen. So I think that we have gone through that already, and there are no magic solutions for that.
So a negative answer then to that suggestion?
No, not negative. It's just saying that, well, capacity markets are in fact a regulated long-term market contracting tool, or even the renewable long-term auctions for PPAs that are very much widespread all over Europe in a way. So this is more or less, the only thing is that my only point is that the long-term market, if it's somehow imposed, has to somehow entail that the regulator pushes demand without asking too much to contract, which I think is a good idea in some cases. I'm not criticizing that, but it's just a fact. Trying to push, for example, utilities to contract might not work very well sometimes, because they don't need to bear risks that they might be for them unbearable in one way or another. This would be the idea. And only one small comment that I can, and I floated, I don't make it. When we talk about reliability options, it is true that it is a hedge for customers against very high prices, but also it is a hedge for some generation for the non-existence of the high prices that they might need to recover their investment. So it's a double hedge. And it is a market that generators get to on a voluntary basis. So to that extent, it is not just a hedge for consumers. I wanted just to highlight that part. You might like it or not, but it's exactly the same, linked to that question that was there made by Rodrigo.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come on in on this topic?
Lee?
Yes, Alberto, would you have a comment?
No, I have a question related to this, to hedging and non-hedging, to Inge, because I think you mentioned at the beginning of your opening statement that some of your members had to reduce production because of the high prices. Now, was this in order to avoid sort of opportunity cost? I mean, they were contracted long term and then found it more profitable to stop production and sell the electricity they contracted long term, or were they not hedged and therefore found that the actual cost, not the opportunity cost, was becoming too high? Because we always start from the assumption that large consumers should be hedged, which would involve the same reaction, to stop producing and selling the electricity that they bought at a fixed price or hedged long term. So is it implicit demand response, explicit demand response, or both?
It can be both. I don't have insight in each company's sourcing strategy, so actually I don't know if they were sourced long term or not. That's not public available information. But I know that some companies were kind of open, so to speak, that they hadn't hedged their energy prices long term, and therefore were directly hit and had to close because of they couldn't. Yes, the costs were higher than their income on products, and their competitive level were distorted because their competitors in other regions was not affected by the rises in energy prices in the same way. So Europe were definitely highest hit by this energy price rise, also because it was not only gas, it was also CO2 price rise, and the weather was not favorable. But it might be that some with long-term PPAs also decided to close and sell the power, but I have no indication of that. And I can speak because I work in a Norwegian aluminum company, the Norsk Hydro, and we didn't close, and we have almost all our demand covered by long-term contracts on kind of 20, 30 years. So we did not close down or curtail.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question coming in from Paolo, which again touches on the subject of PPAs. I think there's quite a lot of interest in this. And the question, he asks that the EC pushes PPAs, but it emerges that financial instruments would be better suited for stability of prices. Why would that be? Would anyone like to reflect on that? Maybe Yvan, have you got any views on that?
But at the end of the day, what you will need for business developers is indeed to secure over the long term, and you will have to get the money somewhere. And you can argue a lot if it's physical or financial, but if you want it to happen, you need at least this possibility to hedge long term. That's I think that's basically the idea. Of course, the difficulty is that when you look at a long-term PPA, you will contract for the full cost of the underlying assets, while the market is based on the marginal pricing. And so when prices are very high, people might argue, yeah, let's go for PPA because it's cheaper. But at the same time, if the price goes very low, they will argue that maybe I should have kept the market and not contract this PPA. So it's where we come back to the discussion before. Different consumers will have different perspective over the future, and they might find the value in having a more stable price instead of having fluctuations with very high, very low prices. They might have other incentives, like for instance, in case of a renewable PPA, just to argue that they contracted this green PPA. But what is important to keep in mind is that given the challenge that is ahead in terms of decarbonization, the investments will be massive in renewable assets, in low carbon assets, in gas-fired assets for some countries, and we'll have to meet this challenge collectively.
Thank you. I seem to recall that PPAs come and go. They're always in fashion at the beginning of a transition, and then people seem to not like them, or at least regulators don't like them, and competition authorities and the Commission has often required such PPAs to be dissolved as they're seen as subsidies in certain jurisdictions. So perhaps they don't offer regulatory certainty. Anyway, I would perhaps add, looking back over the last 20 odd years of the way the European market has evolved. We're coming really now to the closing few minutes of this really fascinating session. So I'd like to turn the floor back to Alberto, who might have a last question to put to the panel, or might want to. Alberto, maybe you have a question you see coming up in the chat you think it would be useful to quickly try to answer or reflect upon before we close the debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. No, I don't have questions, and I think we had quite a rich debate. Maybe just a reflection. There is a lot now of discussion on new ideas, which actually are old ideas, because, for example, this pay as bid versus pay as cleared, we've heard it so many times, and back, I think it goes back almost 20 years, or probably more, in what is the best design, what are the advantages and disadvantages. And it seems that at least clearly the participants in our debates are not a representative sample of the population or all stakeholders, but at least it seems that those who bothered to join us today have pretty clear ideas on the fundamentals of pricing, on the fundamental of the importance of the short-term market, on the fundamental of the role of, what role could a capacity remuneration mechanism have, etc. So it's quite reassuring. Some of the questions in the polls were a bit of a leading questions, but it was just to check that, some of the fundamentals are still there. I don't have further questions. I think it's now, in fact, time to wrap up. I don't know, Lee, if you have any takeaways before I thank everybody.
I think we've had indeed a fascinating discussion, lots of interesting aspects, and I'm not quite sure if it's we're looking at new wine in old bottles, as you might have just hinted at when we're looking at ways to resolve this. But perhaps that's human nature, to reach for the tried and trusted tools rather than come up with some innovative ideas at a time of a crisis in many countries. So perhaps it's to be expected that we try to steer with the instruments we know best.
Okay, so, well, as I said, we're getting to the end. I would like to thank Lee for co-hosting or for hosting and moderating the debate today, Carlos from Logan Airport, Rafael, and congratulations for the work of the agency on this and trying to make sense out of all sometimes very disorderly discussions. Yvan and Inge for their input and contribution. And well, last but by no means least, for Chiara, without whom we would not be here. She's behind the scenes, but she's always making sure that on Wednesday, every month, Lee and I can host a debate. This is the last debate of our series for this year. We will resume the second Wednesday in January, and most likely the topic will be CCU, carbon capture and usage of carbon capture and storage. But we will host an extraordinary session of this event series on the 9th of December, looking at the post-COP26 considerations. So it will be more on climate. It will be organized in cooperation with our colleagues in the climate area of the Florence School of Regulation. So for those who are interested, watch this space. But as I said, the FSR is always online on Wednesday at 2 p.m. most of the time. So continue to join us and continue to follow us. So thank you very much. And well, see you in December and then in January.